but far more relevant to us because it is well known that the mule cannot produce offspring. If human races were different subspecies, they wouldn't be able to breed. If human races were subspecies and were to have sex and produce offspring, there is a possibility of there being offspring, yet that offspring would be sterile, impotent, and incapable of producing viable offspring, just like the mule.
Oh boy. Forget subspecies. There are several examples of different recognized species producing fertile offspring. For example, polar bears and grizzly bears, lions and tigers, and there's one other good example. What is it? Oh, humans and Neanderthals. In this video, and in the previous video, Kraut makes this repeated claim that species is demarcated by the ability to reproduce with, that one species cannot reproduce with another.
The thing that the alt-right seems to ignore consistently is the mere simple fact that the criteria by which biologists separate different species is sexual reproduction. If an animal evolves to a point that it can no longer reproduce with whatever animal it evolved from, it is a new species. Different human races can interbreed. There are mixed-race children, and those mixed-race children are capable of producing offspring. Therefore, from a biological standpoint, the idea that races are subspecies is simply false.
Now, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of the debate about the criteria for species, but safe it to say, Kraut is just wrong. And what this gets at is a very dangerous way of thinking that Kraut engages in.
There is no murky grey line, no room for statistical or other random overlap in a natural science such as biology. There are only clear-cut and simple black and white yes or no answer criteria. Have you ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect?
This is utterly witless. It's just not true, and it's a kind of categorical absolutism that people who don't deal in science tend to think in. Kraut's video is in two parts. First, I'll respond to Kraut, and then I'll respond to his rationalwiki.org text spinner program. And regarding Kraut's video, his main criticism is of an argument that I literally did not make. He went on a whole huge tirade. He went crazy about how I claimed there existed a correlation between heterozygosity and the number of subspecies. I literally did not do this. I ran no regressions. I claimed no correlation. I did not make this argument. All I was claiming in this part of the article was that there existed enough variation in humans to potentially have subspecies, and this variation clusters well enough to potentially have subspecies. That's it. It was simply to counter a public perception that there's not enough variation in humans to have races, subspecies. We'll get into that later. And just as a little aside here, he was wrong about the conventional classification of correlation strength. Using Cohen's criteria, which is the most commonly used criteria for this, 0.41 would be classified as a moderate correlation if you care about such things. But this whole correlation thing, I can't stress this enough. I did not make this argument. Now, unlike Kraut, I'll actually link to the article I'm talking about here. That's another thing. At the time of this recording, Kraut did not have a link to the article he was attacking in the description. Like, what? Like, to me, that's unthinkable. That's wild. Like, to not link to what you're arguing against? Like, what the hell? Like, do you not trust your audience to see what, like, that's crazy. That's inconceivable. Okay, so back to races, subspecies. What am I talking about? And this actually gets into Kraut's second lie, that I referenced no biological arguments. The bulk of the article was actually about the genetic cluster analyses. In fact, that was the main argument of the article. Okay, Kraut literally pretended that this whole part of the paper, the cluster analyses, did not exist. And he even explicitly stated that such arguments did not exist in the article in his video.
With several more survey after survey after survey on the use of terms rather than any kind of opinion paper, let alone an biology paper.
It's just so bald-faced what he's doing. Okay, for the benefit of the audience, the way these are done, these cluster analyses are done, is they create an algorithm for clustering genetic data into clusters. And then the researchers look at the correspondence between best fit cluster and self-identified race. One criticism of this is that they tell the computer the number of clusters to put people in beforehand. The computer, however, doesn't know about the self-identification. It's just given a bunch of data and told to divide it into X number of clusters. And what is found repeatedly is that these best fit clusters correspond to self-identified race around 98% of the time. A lot of normies like to imagine that taxonomy is some like really strict thing, but look, one common criteria for defining subspecies was, and it's still used a little bit, is the 75% rule. Okay, you want to know what the 75% rule is? It's that if you can divide 75% of two populations from each other by eyeing it, by eyeball, then it constitutes subspecies. This is real. Link in the description. And if this shatters your faith in like Star Trek science and objective absolute taxonomy, good, it should. The messiness and subjectiveness of biological classification that Kraut warns will sort of lead to perdition, that's the reality today. And let's just look at the Wikipedia on this, on the definition of subspecies. These are separate groups that are clearly distinct from one another and do not generally interbreed, although there may be a relatively narrow hybridization zone, but which may interbreed if given the chance to do so. These subspecies, races, or populations can be named as subspecies by zoologists or in more varied ways by botanists and microbiologists. Now this sounds like it describes human races to a T. They are clearly distinct from one another, and they did not generally interbreed until they were given the chance to do so. Right? Mass transportation, industrial revolution. Okay, but Kraut wants his dumb absolute categories that don't exist and that his supposed experts never sat him down and told him don't exist. Okay, species is a useful concept, but nature, out there with all the buzz and variation, it doesn't give a shit about your categories. And here's another thing, that includes human races too. Which is why Kraut's demand for some hard definition of race is just ridiculous.
But what the alternative hypothesis thinks of the science of biology and its classifications is revealed within the last segment of this article. Quote, "One tactic of race denial is to get really hard up on some super explicit definition of race. Races are obviously just populations of people geographically separated that interbred and thus are genetically and physically distinguishable. That's obviously true and all you need, and we should be able to just go forward and talk about the genetic differences between these races." The only denial here is the alt-right's denial of science. There's a very good reason why biologists do not engage in wishy-washy definition games.
Define subspecies, and ultimately, it doesn't matter whether you define it or not, because we have self-identification matching best fit clusters. And that's going to be a reality, however it is I define race or not. So done. What more do you want? If you want a hard definition from me, fine. Here's a hard definition. Here's a hard definition from Ryan Falk. Best fit clusters when the number of clusters is set to 9. So I can give you a hard definition. Is your understanding of the world enhanced by this? But frankly, that's more of a guideline, and when you start thinking in terms of these hard definitions, your brain narrows sort of into the strictures of those definitions. And that's why I don't like thinking in these really hard definitions, right? These taxonomical categories, they're just guidelines. They're not the thing in itself. Now, there are some other things that Kraut said that I would be a bit remiss if I didn't address. He claims that there was only one working link in the article that he was responding to, which is such a weird thing to lie about. Now, granted, fair enough, he did find a dead link, which I promptly fixed, but all the other links I checked were working. And this is such a weird lie. I know, I get it. It's supposed to be a little credibility jab. I know all this little persuasion games he's doing. It's dishonest and it's very easily checkable. And it's such a little thing, but it's just so brazen. The risk reward thing doesn't make sense. Why would you lie about that? Moreover, I offered to talk to Kraut several times before he decided to go off and talk to these experts and make these videos. Kraut could have easily contacted me, told me a link was dead, and I would have fixed it, and I would have given him the paper. Why didn't he do that? Why did he instead choose radio silence and then bring this up in a YouTube video? He also talked about storks and spurious correlations. This was kind of related to his phantom debate about my argument about the correlation between heterozygosity and number of subspecies. And what he said about the storks and spurious correlation, like, it's fine, yeah, it's the problem of induction. Right, okay. And science is about what works, what theories make valid predictions, causation being ultimately inferred from a kind of predictive validity of well-supported theories. That's it. Right? There's no proof. Proof is for, the saying, proof is for mathematicians and alcoholics. But this sort of stork thing, this is something that he and the Dr. Rational Wiki Text Spinner, what they do is, this is reading the phone book, right? Saying a bunch of stuff that I guess it's not wrong, it's all correct, but it's not directly relevant to anything that's being argued about. And I think it's done to sort of like build up their credibility, like spending a long time talking about the sickle cells or spending a lot of time talking about spurious correlations. I guess sort of the implication is that I know these things and people on the alt-right, they don't know. People on the alt-right don't know about spurious correlations and the problem of induction, right? But I know that. It's weird and it's really dumb and petty. Okay, now I don't want to make a 3-hour video, so that'll be it for Kraut here. Now let's go into the doctorate guy. So about half the time, this guy's reading the phone book, right, talking about sickle cell anemia and about how natural selection works. I guess Kraut's audience is 12 or something. But then the doctorate guy said something that is depressingly common.
There's no data and no scientific reason which would allow us to equate the trait intelligence with a trait like sickle-like shape of red blood cells.
Now, to me, it's really obvious how dopey this is. So we got these populations, they cluster nicely, and these populations can differ on genes associated with cognitive traits, as well as genes that are responsible for phenotypic traits that are the basis for the classification scheme, okay? If you're assuming you're classifying based on phenotypic traits, okay? Now, these populations, they can differ in allele frequency on genes associated with intelligence. It doesn't, for example, have to be that the genes that cause differences in skin color are also responsible for the cognitive difference. There's literally no reason why that would have to be the case. I don't get why people make this kind of bizarre argument. In addition, populations differ more on genes associated with neural development, or at least certain types of neural development, than they do on genes associated with skin pigmentation. Like, there's no reason to focus on the genes that are responsible for the superficial race differences when talking about cognitive differences between the races. Or, how about this? When someone says black people are faster, what if, Dr. Text Spinner came in and said, well, that's silly. How can having darker skin, broader noses, and nappy hair cause someone to run faster? Right? Do you see how stupid a criticism that would be? Okay. That's exactly what he's doing with the brain.
At least 52 genes are tied to intelligence and IQ, but it's pretty likely that there are many, many more genes involved. There's no data and no scientific reason which would allow us to equate the trait intelligence with a trait like sickle-like shape of red blood cells.
Okay, so this is wrong on 2 levels. The first level is it's just simply wrong. Like, David Piffer has found genes associated with IQ differences within populations, controlled for a bunch of stuff, and tried to guard against a spurious correlation, and found that those allele frequencies at those gene locations differ between generally recognized races. Piffer's correlation explains a large chunk of it, but that's just it, right? Explains. It's just a correlation. Are these genes that he's found that explain these gaps, are they actually causal? Maybe, maybe not. Which gets into why find the genes is kind of stupid for complex trait. Because let's say you find a gene and see that correlates with IQ differences. Okay. Say I find that skin color correlates with IQ differences. As high-tech as your genome sequencer is, it's basically the same argument. Finding the genes doesn't free you from the problem of induction. And this is why I think, for now, that ye olde twin studies and other top-down ways of inferring heritability are still, at this point, superior than sort of bottom-up molecular genetics explanation for highly polygenic traits, things like IQ, or height. So the doctor man is wrong on 2 counts. First, he's wrong in saying that there's no molecular genetic evidence for race differences in intelligence. But second, he's wrong to focus so much on molecular genetics at this point. when the top-down methods are still produce much more complete results and make much more valid predictions. Now, most people have not heard of Piffer's work. That's fine. So, like, a normie would be forgiven for not knowing about Piffer's work, but Kraut's not a normie. Again, I tried to talk to Kraut. I offered to review his videos and all this stuff. I would have told him this, but he refused. So Kraut has no excuses on this, and neither does his tech spinner program.
Another important point. Groups based on descriptions of race or ethnicity, so-called continental populations, do not show distinct differences, they are not homogeneous, and there is a big overlap between populations.
Okay, this is actually false, and I already explained this in a video response to ContraPoint, so I'll just use that clip here to show that in two discrete populations, for example with an FST distance of 0.1, there will be virtually zero overlap in whole genome similarity. And a simplified way to explain why this is wrong is to use binomial probability. Nevan Sasardik does a much more in-depth explanation than this, but think of each gene as a loaded coin flip. And say with each coin flip you have a 60% chance of being more similar to someone of your own genetic cluster, however defined, than to someone of another cluster. If humans only had one gene, i.e. one coin flip, well, you would be more similar to someone of another cluster only around 40% of the time, and would only have a greater similarity to someone within your cluster 60% of the time. If you have 20 genes, this goes up to around 75%. If you have 100 genes, this goes up to something like 96 or 97%. And by the time you get to 500 genes or 500 coin flips, you're at virtually 100% chance of being more similar to someone in your own cluster than to someone in another cluster. Of course, in reality, it's not quite like this. It's not that you have a 10% chance of greater similarity evenly distributed across the whole genome to another person in your cluster. That's just the average. In reality, it's more like you have a 90% chance of greater similarity at a few locations, and everywhere else it's like 50%, 50%, 51%, 50%, 98%, 50%, 50%. It's like that. So, like who is this guy, and how did he ever get 130,000 subscribers? Now, this is a bit tough for me because I have to go on defense, which is always more difficult than going on offense, and I'm having to, respond to videos that he's made over like a month in like a day, but I'm getting a whole bunch of new viewers from this. Now, Kraut tried to dox someone. People on YouTube reacted very negatively toward it, and so in a sense, Kraut was sort of beat up by the alt-right indirectly in a way that he really couldn't fight back. He really couldn't fight back about it because, you dox someone, you're gonna take your lumps for it. What really can you do? You can't really fight back. He couldn't really fight back. But he was still mad, and he was mad at the alt-right. He still had those emotions that came from the Rage After Storm doxing. So he wants to get back at the alt-right in a way that's socially acceptable, and that means debunking the alt-right. That's why these videos are so brazenly dishonest. That's like making up things like, Millennia Woes thinking that black people lay eggs, or my phantom correlation argument, when it's just not there. I just did not make that argument. It's really something. And another thing I'm glad that's happening, I'm glad he's got those PhDs advising him, because that helps to blow out some of that academia mystique.